The sound that silenced the room wasn't a gunshot or a shouted command. It was the unmistakable, bone-deep crack of a breaking arm, sharp enough to slice through the low roar of conversation and lodge itself permanently in the memory of every man who heard it. For half a second, time stalled inside a windowless auditorium on a secure naval base, the kind of place where secrets lived and egos thrived, and more than 250 Navy SEALs froze mid-movement, staring at a Marine captain crumpled on the floor and a young woman standing calmly a few feet away, her hands open, her expression unreadable. That moment didn't come from nowhere. It was built brick by brick through assumption, arrogance, and a complete failure to recognize danger when it was standing quietly in front of you. And before we rewind and walk you there, tell me something. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your location in the comments, because stories like this travel far beyond any one base, any one room. The day began like any other high-level joint symposium, the kind that pulled together elite units and senior leadership under the banner of professional development. Though everyone present understood, it was just as much about posturing as learning. The auditorium itself was cavernous and sterile, tiered seating rising like a concrete amphitheater, walls painted in institutional gray, the air faintly smelling of coffee, metal, and the lingering ghost of sweat soaked into uniforms over decades. Men filtered and wearing subdued confidence, sealed tridents on chests, relaxed postures that masked lethal capability, quiet laughter exchanged between operators who'd shared real darkness together. Near the side wall, almost invisible against the backdrop of movement and noise, stood Lena Morales. At 28, she didn't look like what most people expected danger to look like. She wore jeans, a neutral hoodie, no insignia, no badge swinging from her neck, just a slim tablet tucked under her arm and the kind of stillness that only came from long familiarity with chaos. She had arrived early on purpose, choosing a spot where she could see exits, sightlines, people, habits she never bothered trying to unlearn. From a distance, she could have been mistaken for a contractor, a graduate student, maybe someone's assistant waiting to hand off materials. That miscalculation was the seed of everything that followed. The Marine captain noticed her precisely because she didn't fit the visual pattern his mind expected. He was mid-30s, tall, squared shoulders, the kind of man whose authority had rarely been challenged in spaces like this. To him, this was his environment, his tribe, his rules. When he broke away from a small knot of Marines and walked toward her, it wasn't with overt hostility at first. It was with the casual certainty of someone correcting an error. He stopped just inside her personal space and spoke low, sharp, confident. "You can't be in here." Lena looked up slowly, meeting his eyes without surprise, without apology. She told him she was scheduled to speak later that afternoon, her tone neutral, factual, as if clarifying a calendar misunderstanding. The captain laughed, a short dismissive sound meant to signal dominance as much as amusement, glancing over his shoulder toward nearby SEALs as if to invite them to share in the absurdity of her claim. In his mind, this was harmless, putting a lost civilian back in her lane. He told her the event was restricted, that she needed to leave before security got involved. Around them, the room continued to fill, voices overlapping, chairs scraping, unaware that a line was already being crossed. Lena didn't move. She didn't raise her voice. She simply said she wasn't leaving. That was the moment irritation crept into his expression, the first crack in his certainty. He mistook her calm for defiance, her stillness for weakness. He repeated himself, slower this time, sharper, emphasizing authority instead of reason. When she still didn't move, he reached out. Not violently, not yet, but decisively, fingers closing around her forearm in what he probably thought was a corrective gesture, a physical punctuation mark to end the interaction. To him, it was control. To her, it was contact. And contact changed the equation entirely. Lena's awareness narrowed instantly, her body responding faster than conscious thought, years of training snapping into place without drama or hesitation. She felt his grip, assessed pressure, angle, balance, all in a fraction of a second. The noise of the room dulled as her focus sharpened. She warned him once, quietly, clearly, telling him not to touch her again. He didn't hear the warning for what it was. He heard it as challenge. His grip tightened. Around them, a few nearby conversations faltered, attention drawn by tone and proximity. Some SEALs glanced over, sensing something off but not yet alarming, curiosity flickering behind seasoned eyes. The captain leaned in, voice lower now, authority tinged with irritation, telling her she didn't belong. And in that instant, the outcome was already decided. Lena moved, not explosively, not theatrically, but efficiently, stepping inside his balance line, rotating her hips, redirecting his force instead of meeting it, applying a controlled, practiced technique designed to incapacitate without excess. The crack came not from rage, but from physics. Bone met leverage and lost. The captain screamed and dropped, shock and pain crashing through him simultaneously as his arm failed him. Silence slammed down on the auditorium, heavy and absolute, as if the room itself had inhaled and forgotten how to breathe. 250 SEALs stared at the scene before them, not shouting, not rushing in, but watching with the focused stillness of professionals who recognized something real had just happened. Lena released immediately and stepped back, hands open, posture relaxed but ready, her face calm, almost detached. She hadn't escalated, she'd ended the threat. Security personnel began moving instinctively, confusion rippling outward, but before anyone could speak, before anyone could rewrite the narrative, the damage, to Bone, to ego, to assumption, was already done. And this was only the beginning. The silence after the break was not empty but charged, thick with calculation and disbelief, the kind that only settles in rooms full of professionals who understand exactly how much damage a single second can contain. And as the Marine captain lay on the floor clutching his arm, his face contorted in shock more than pain, the attention of every Navy SEAL in the auditorium fixed on the woman who had done it. Lena Morales standing a few steps back with her palms open, shoulders relaxed, breathing steady, as if she had merely corrected a misstep rather than dismantled a man in front of witnesses who knew violence intimately. Security converged late, their movements hesitant, unsure whether they were responding to an incident or interrupting a lesson already concluded, and it was in that hesitation that the room began to reassess what it had just seen, not through outrage but through a colder lens of recognition. The captain tried to speak, to assert something, authority, injury, injustice, but the words came out fractured, swallowed by pain and the dawning awareness that he had lost control of the narrative the moment he put his hands on her. Lena didn't move toward him or away from him. She simply existed in the space with quiet certainty, her eyes scanning the room automatically, noting who was tense, who was curious, who already understood. Several SEALs leaned back in their seats, arms crossed, expressions unreadable but alert, while others exchanged quick glances that said more than words ever could. This wasn't chaos. This was consequence. The Rear Admiral overseeing the symposium stepped forward then, his presence cutting through the moment with the weight of command earned over decades rather than demanded by rank, his gaze passing briefly over the fallen Marine before settling on Lena with something that looked suspiciously like confirmation. He asked her to explain, and she did so plainly, stating facts without embellishment, describing the contact, the warning, the response, her voice level and precise, each word chosen like a tool rather than a weapon. As she spoke, the Admiral listened not as a judge searching for fault, but as a professional reconstructing a timeline, and when she finished, he nodded once, the kind of nod that closed doors rather than opened debates. He ordered security to stand down, and the shift in the room was immediate, the tension breaking not into relief but into understanding, a collective recalibration as the SEALs absorbed what that single command implied. The Marine captain was no longer the center of gravity, Lena was. Medical personnel arrived, lifting the captain carefully, splinting his arm as his embarrassment deepened into something heavier, something far more difficult to carry than pain. He avoided looking at her as he was escorted out, and she didn't watch him go. Her attention had already moved forward. The Admiral addressed the room then, introducing her not with flourish but with clarity, naming her credentials, her age, 28, and the work she had done since her early 20s, advising Joint Special Operations units on threat dynamics, restraint protocols, and the psychology of escalation, each sentence landing harder than applause ever could. The murmurs that followed were not disbelief but alignment, operators replaying the moment in their minds. matching the movement they'd seen with the explanation they were now receiving, the pieces fitting too cleanly to deny. Lena was invited to the podium, and she walked there without ceremony, not savoring the moment, not shrinking from it either, simply occupying it as someone accustomed to standing in rooms where attention carried weight. When she spoke, she didn't reference the incident directly. She didn't need to. She talked instead about assumptions, about how threat assessment failed most often not because of ignorance, but because of certainty, about how the belief that you are in control is often the most dangerous variable in any environment. She spoke of contact thresholds, of how touching someone without understanding who they are or what they carry can turn routine into catastrophic in less than a heartbeat. Her words grounded in experience rather than theory. Each example stripped of drama, but heavy with implication. The room leaned in, not because she demanded it, but because she had already proven that what she said mattered. Faces that had initially held amusement or skepticism now reflected something closer to respect, the kind that comes not from rank, but from demonstrated capability. As she continued, the earlier incident faded from spectacle into context. No longer the headline, but the opening chapter of a lesson unfolding in real time. One that no one in the room would forget, because it had already cost something tangible. The SEALs listened not as students being lectured, but as peers being challenged, and when she concluded, there was no immediate applause, just a brief, charged pause before the room responded in the only way it knew how: quiet nods, exchanged looks, and unspoken acknowledgement that something important had just occurred. The symposium moved on, schedules resumed, but the atmosphere had shifted permanently, the air carrying a sharper awareness, a reminder etched not into policy, but into memory. Danger does not always announce itself. Authority does not guarantee control, and the most consequential moments often begin with a single, careless assumption. By the time the symposium formally adjourned and the last slide faded from the screen, the auditorium no longer felt like the same room it had been that morning. The air was heavier, not with tension, but with awareness, the kind that lingers after something irreversible has happened and everyone present understands they've crossed an invisible threshold. The Marine captain was gone, escorted out quietly through a side exit, his arm immobilized in a rigid splint, his face drawn tight, not just from pain, but from the dawning realization that the damage he'd done extended far beyond bone and ligament. In military culture, wounds heal, reputations are slower, and mistakes witnessed by the right people have a way of following you into every room thereafter. Lena Morales remained, not at the center of attention, but firmly within it, answering questions from admirals, command chiefs, and operators with the same measured clarity she'd shown all day, never defensive, never triumphant, never softening the truth to make it easier to swallow. What unsettled people most wasn't what she'd done, but how little emotion she attached to it. As if the incident were not a dramatic rupture, but the predictable conclusion of a poorly assessed decision tree. Behind closed doors, the machinery of accountability turned. Statements were taken, footage reviewed, timelines reconstructed down to seconds, and every official record reflected the same uncomfortable sequence. Repeated verbal boundaries ignored, physical contact initiated by the captain, a clear warning issued, and a response that was immediate, proportional, and technically precise. There was no ambiguity to hide behind, no gray space wide enough to reinterpret reality. Senior leadership understood this instantly, not because they sided with her, but because the facts demanded it. The Marine captain's actions were reframed not as a momentary lapse, but as a failure of command judgment, the kind that reveals deeper assumptions about authority, entitlement, and who is presumed to belong in certain spaces. The consequences he faced were not theatrical or public, but they were thorough: mandatory retraining, removal from select billets, and a formal note placed where it would quietly shape the remainder of his career. It was the kind of correction designed not to destroy, but to ensure the lesson could never be forgotten. Among the Navy SEALs, the story took on a different life. In the hours after, small groups lingered in hallways and outside the building, conversations low and analytical, replaying the moment not with shock, but with professional curiosity. They talked about her timing, her economy of motion, the way she'd stepped inside the captain's balance instead of meeting force with force. They talked about how quickly she'd disengaged once the threat was neutralized, how she hadn't chased dominance or spectacle. But inevitably, the discussion always circled back to the same point. She'd recognized the situation for what it was before anyone else had. That recognition, situational awareness sharpened by experience rather than bravado, was what most of them respected the most. It was what separated trained violence from undisciplined aggression, a distinction every operator in that room understood in their bones. Lena herself treated the aftermath the same way she treated the incident, as something to be acknowledged, processed, and then put in its proper place. When asked if she regretted the outcome, she answered without hesitation that regret belonged to moments when better options were ignored, not when boundaries were enforced clearly and decisively. She spoke about restraint not as the absence of action, but as the discipline to act only when necessary and to stop the moment necessity ended. Her words carried weight precisely because they weren't polished for effect. They were shaped by repetition, by having seen what happens when people confuse authority with control and confidence with competence. She reminded them that escalation rarely announces itself loudly, that it often begins with small dismissals, casual assumptions, and the belief that someone else will absorb discomfort rather than resist it. In the days that followed, the incident spread through the base and beyond, not as a sensational rumor, but as a quietly circulating case study. Instructors referenced it without naming names. Commanders folded it into discussions about professional conduct, threat perception, and the dangers of unchecked certainty. Junior personnel heard it secondhand and thirdhand, each retelling sharpening the moral rather than the drama. What endured was not the image of a Marine on the floor, but the realization that the most consequential mistakes are often made in moments that feel routine, when vigilance is relaxed and respect is assumed instead of earned. Lena returned to her usual work, briefings, consultations, behind-the-scenes preparation meant to prevent problems before they ever reached a breaking point. But something had shifted in the environments she entered. The initial skepticism she'd grown accustomed to softened faster now, replaced by a quieter attentiveness, a recognition that did not need explanation. For the Marine captain, the incident became a dividing line, a before and after that followed him in ways both subtle and inescapable. He would carry the memory not as a story of being wronged, but as a hard-earned lesson about restraint, humility, and the cost of misjudging someone based on appearance alone. For everyone else who witnessed it, the lesson was broader and more uncomfortable. That danger does not always look dangerous. That professionalism is tested most when it feels unnecessary, and that respect withheld until proven safe is already a liability. Long after the symposium ended and the auditorium returned to its sterile quiet, the truth remained etched into collective memory. Real control is quiet. Capability often goes unannounced, and the moment you assume you are the most dangerous person in the room is usually the moment you stop being right.